When I first bought the land, I thought I had finally escaped the chaos of city life. It was a quiet stretch of countryside on the edge of town, 30 acres of rolling fields, old oak trees, and a winding creek that cut through the property. The kind of place where you could breathe, where the air was sharp in the mornings and the nights were dark enough to see the stars. The property had been in limbo for years, sitting unused after the previous owner passed away. When I signed the papers, the real estate agent explained that while the land bordered a subdivision called Silverwood Estates, it wasn't technically part of it. That detail didn't matter to me at the time. All I wanted was peace, some space to stretch out, and maybe one day to build a house overlooking the creek. For the first few months, it was exactly that, peaceful. I set up a small trailer to live in temporarily, spent my days clearing brush, and planned how to design the house I wanted. Neighbors from Silverwood waved when they drove by, but they mostly kept to themselves. I figured I would eventually meet more of them as time went on. Then, one morning, I found a letter taped to the door of my trailer. It was typed on stiff white paper, stamped with the emblem of the Silverwood Homeowners Association. The letter began politely enough, welcoming me as part of the community. But halfway down, the tone shifted. It stated I was in violation of several bylaws and that I owed $3,500 in fines. The violations listed were almost laughable: improper lawn maintenance, unauthorized vehicle storage, and construction without HOA approval. I looked around at the open field stretching into the distance, my truck parked by the fence and my trailer tucked under the trees. It was my land. I hadn't signed up for an HOA. How could they find me? At first, I assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error. Surely someone in their office had confused my property with one of theirs. I ignored it, thinking the matter would resolve itself once they realized their mistake, but the letters kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines stacked higher, $10,000, then $25,000. They claimed I owed late penalties, administrative fees, and daily violation charges. Before long, the total was an absurd $250,000. I couldn't believe it. $250,000 in fines for violations on land that didn't even fall under their jurisdiction. It was harassment disguised as bureaucracy, and it was only the beginning. Soon, my phone started buzzing with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. When I picked up, it was always the same: HOA representatives demanding payment, threatening legal action, and insisting they had authority over my property. I told them calmly at first, and then more firmly, that my land wasn't part of their subdivision. They didn't care. Then came the visitors. HOA board members showed up at my property line, clipboards in hand, jotting notes, taking photos, peering through binoculars as if they were inspectors. I asked them to leave, but they returned the next day, and the day after that. The strangest part was the confidence with which they carried themselves, as though they truly believed they owned not just the streets of Silverwood, but everything within sight of them. Their arrogance was staggering. At night, I lay awake wondering how far they'd take it. Would they really sue me? Could they somehow seize my land through sheer persistence? The thought gnawed at me. But one evening, while digging through old county records at the clerk's office, I stumbled across something that made my stomach flip. The subdivision of Silverwood Estates. Every cul-de-sac, every manicured yard, every home built on its grid of streets sat squarely on land that was originally part of the same parcel I now owned. Decades earlier, when the area was first being developed, the original landowner had leased portions of it for residential construction. Roads were laid, homes were built, and the neighborhood came to life. But the leases were temporary, and while they had been renewed for years, something had gone wrong with the paperwork during a messy transfer of ownership. The result was stunning. The HOA thought they owned the land beneath their neighborhood, but legally it had reverted back to the original parcel, the parcel I had just purchased. I didn't just own my 30 acres by the creek. On paper, I owned their entire neighborhood. The realization left me reeling. All the threats, all the fines, all the arrogance, it was built on nothing more than assumption. They believed they had power over me, but in reality, I had power over them. I wasn't sure what to do with this information yet, but I knew one thing for certain. The game had changed. The HOA thought they were squeezing me into submission with a $250,000 fine. What they didn't know was that I held the deed to their streets, their homes, and the ground beneath their feet. And soon, they were going to find out. The discovery that I technically owned the entire subdivision of Silverwood Estates rattled me. At first, I could hardly believe it. I pored over the county records, reading line after line, cross-referencing maps, deeds, and lease agreements. But every time I checked, it led back to the same conclusion. The HOA had been operating for decades on a foundation of paperwork that didn't support their authority. Their homes, their manicured lawns, their roads, even their community center, all of it stood on land that, by a fluke of history and poor record-keeping, was mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had fined me $250,000 for violations on my property, all while failing to realize that they were the ones trespassing on mine. Their arrogance had blinded them, and now their empire rested on the fragile foundation of assumption. For days, I wrestled with the knowledge. It wasn't just a question of legal power, it was a moral one, too. Did I march in and declare my ownership, evicting families who had lived there for years? Or did I use the information as leverage, exposing their hypocrisy without tearing apart people's lives? The HOA had been ruthless with me, but the residents weren't my enemies. Many of them had no idea what the board was doing in their name. I couldn't punish them for the sins of a handful of power-hungry leaders. Still, I knew I couldn't let the HOA keep pushing me around. So I decided to push back. The first step was to stop ignoring their threats. When the next letter arrived, this one stamped "Final Notice" in bold red ink, demanding immediate payment of $250,000, I didn't crumple it up or toss it in the trash. Instead, I made copies and sent them straight to my lawyer. We crafted a response, not aggressive, but sharp enough to cut through their delusion. It laid out, in black and white, that my land was not part of Silverwood Estates, that their fines had no legal standing, and that further harassment would open them up to liability. Attached was a copy of the deed, clearly showing the boundaries. Days passed with no response. Then, just as I thought they might finally back off, the HOA doubled down. They escalated from letters to full-on legal threats. I received notice that they intended to place a lien on my property. It was laughable on its face, but the sheer gall of it made my blood boil. They wanted to stake a claim on something that didn't belong to them, and they were willing to drag me through court to do it. That's when I knew it was time to use the ace up my sleeve. I drafted a letter of my own, this one addressed not to the board, but to every resident of Silverwood Estates. I had it copied and delivered to every mailbox in the neighborhood. Inside, I explained the truth, that the HOA had no authority over me because my land wasn't part of their subdivision. I included copies of the county records showing the boundaries, and, carefully, without sounding threatening, I pointed out the shocking twist. The land beneath their neighborhood wasn't technically theirs either. I didn't make demands. I didn't threaten eviction or upheaval. I simply stated the facts, backed up by documentation, and suggested they begin asking serious questions about what their HOA had been doing all these years. The fallout was immediate. The next day, I couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of eyes on me. Neighbors who once glared or whispered behind curtains now stared openly, their expressions a mixture of shock, fear, and curiosity. Conversations broke out in driveways, on porches, at the community playground. The news spread like wildfire. The HOA that had ruled over them for years didn't actually have the legal ground to stand on. Within a week, cracks began to form in their facade. A group of residents showed up at my trailer, not hostile but desperate for answers. They asked me if it was true, if I really owned their neighborhood. I showed them the same documents I'd attached in the letters. They left in stunned silence, and I knew they'd carry the truth back to the others. Meanwhile, the HOA board went into damage control. They held an emergency meeting at the community center, inviting every resident to attend. I wasn't invited, of course, but word of what happened reached me soon enough. The president of the HOA, a man named Gerald who wore polo shirts like armor and spoke with the smug authority of someone who had never been questioned, tried to spin the situation. He claimed my documents were fake, that I was lying to sow division. He insisted the board had full authority and that the residents should trust the system. But trust is fragile. Once broken, it doesn't return easily. And after years of heavy-handed fines, arbitrary rules, and inflated dues, the residents were ready to question everything. My letter hadn't just exposed a legal loophole, it had cracked open years of simmering resentment. Soon I began receiving calls and emails from residents themselves. Some apologized for the way the HOA had treated me. Others begged me not to take their homes, terrified I would suddenly demand rent or evict them. I reassured them I had no intention of doing that, but I couldn't ignore the growing power I held. The HOA, however, wasn't finished. They retaliated in petty ways at first. My trash bins mysteriously disappeared. My mailbox was knocked down twice in a week. Someone sprayed graffiti on my fence. Get out! Then one morning I woke to find two men in suits standing at the edge of my property, accompanied by a sheriff's deputy. They were there to serve me with official papers. The HOA had filed a lawsuit demanding enforcement of their fines. I almost laughed as I accepted the envelope. They were suing me for $250,000 in violations, on land they didn't own. While living on land, I did. It was absurd. But absurdity doesn't stop lawsuits. I immediately handed the case to my lawyer, who was practically giddy at the chance to dismantle their arguments in court. But even as we prepared our defense, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer about money or violations. It was about control. The HOA had built their power on intimidation, and now that power was slipping. They weren't fighting for rules. They were fighting for survival. As the court date loomed, tension in the neighborhood grew thick. Silverwood Estates was no longer a pristine suburban paradise. It was divided, fractured, residents caught between loyalty to the HOA and fear of what I might do with my newfound ownership. The night before the first hearing, I sat on the porch of my trailer staring at the subdivision lights glowing in the distance. A place that had once seemed like a tidy little community now looked like a kingdom built on lies, and soon in court the truth would come out. The morning of the court hearing, Silverwood Estates looked different. The neighborhood that had once carried itself with a smug, manicured pride now seemed tense, almost brittle. Cars lined the streets outside the county courthouse. Families from the subdivision streaming toward the entrance as if it were a spectacle they couldn't afford to miss. To them, it was more than a legal dispute. It was the unraveling of their world. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. On one side sat the HOA board, crisp in matching suits, their expressions fixed in masks of authority. At the center was Gerald, the HOA president, radiating his usual arrogance. His clipboard was replaced by a thick binder of supposed evidence, which he handled as though it were a sword about to strike. On the other side sat me, my lawyer at my elbow, and a folder thick with documents, deeds, maps, and rulings that I had spent weeks gathering. Behind me sat a surprising number of Silverwood residents, their faces caught between curiosity and suspicion. Some still clung to the HOA's version of events, but many had begun to doubt. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The case was called, and the HOA wasted no time making their accusations. Gerald stood first, his voice booming with self-assurance. He claimed I had racked up $250,000 in violations, unapproved structures, improper landscaping, and failure to comply with HOA covenants. He painted me as a rogue landowner trying to undermine community standards, threatening property values and destabilizing the neighborhood. Each sentence dripped with condescension, as though I were a child being scolded. His attorney echoed his arguments, presenting photographs of my trailer, my truck, even my firewood stack as evidence of my supposed crimes. They waved the HOA bylaws like sacred scripture, pointing out clause after clause that I had allegedly violated. For a moment, their confidence filled the room. I could see some of the residents nodding along, comforted by the familiar authority of the board. It was the same confidence the HOA had always wielded, a shield of rules, wielded so forcefully that people rarely dared to question whether those rules applied at all. But then, it was our turn. My lawyer rose, calm and deliberate. He began not with emotion, but with facts. He placed the deed on the judge's desk, a certified copy straight from the county clerk's office. He laid out survey maps showing the precise boundaries of my land, boundaries that fell outside Silverwood Estates. He referenced the subdivision's own charter, which clearly listed the parcels under their jurisdiction, and mine was absent. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs spread through the residents seated behind me. Some leaned forward, scanning the documents with wide eyes. Others whispered angrily to one another, already sensing betrayal. Then came the bombshell. My lawyer presented the historical records, the leases, the expired agreements, and the title transfers that had reverted the land beneath Silverwood Estates back into the original parcel. He explained, slowly and clearly, that while the residents owned their homes, the HOA had been operating under the false belief that they controlled the land itself. In reality, ownership had defaulted to me when I purchased the entire parcel. I didn't need to embellish. The facts spoke louder than any accusation. The judge studied the documents carefully, her brow furrowed as she traced the chain of ownership. When she finally looked up, her gaze swept across the HOA board like a hammer about to fall. Gerald sputtered in protest. He accused me of fraud, of forging documents, of colluding with county officials. His voice rose, shrill and desperate, as he tried to claw back control. But his attorney's face told the real story. Pale, tight-lipped, realizing the case was collapsing under the weight of undeniable truth. The judge silenced Gerald with a sharp bang of the gavel. She reminded him this was not a stage for theatrics, but a court of law. Then she turned her focus to me and my lawyer, asking a series of pointed questions. Each one was met with evidence, documentation, and verification from the county clerk. Piece by piece, the truth crystallized. By the time my lawyer sat down, the entire courtroom knew the verdict was inevitable. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my property. Their fines were invalid, their threats baseless. Worse, their claim to authority rested on land they didn't even own. For decades, they had operated under an illusion of power, bullying residents with rules and penalties that had no foundation. The judge dismissed their lawsuit outright, ruling the $250,000 fine unenforceable. She even hinted that the HOA could face consequences for filing frivolous claims and harassing me. Gerald's face turned red, his hands trembling as he tried to compose himself. The board members beside him looked as though the ground had crumbled beneath their feet. But the most striking reaction came from the residents. Gasps, whispers, and outright outrage rippled through the crowd. People stood, demanding answers, turning on the very board members who had lectured and fined them for years. Accusations flew about inflated dues, arbitrary rules, and years of intimidation. The HOA had spent decades building a facade of authority, but now it was unraveling in real time. And all I had done was pull back the curtain. As the hearing ended, the judge adjourned with a final warning. If the HOA continued to harass me, they would face legal consequences. The board gathered their papers in silence, their former arrogance replaced by the stunned quiet of defeat. I walked out of the courthouse, the weight of months of harassment lifted from my shoulders. But as I stepped into the sunlight, I realized the battle wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. The HOA had lost in court, but I knew Gerald wouldn't let go so easily. Power was his lifeblood, and now it had been stripped from him in front of his subjects. That kind of humiliation breeds desperation. Sure enough, within hours, the fallout began. Residents filled the streets of Silverwood Estates, some cheering the outcome, others shouting at board members who scurried back to their homes. Rumors spread quickly about dues being misused, about fraudulent filings, about shady dealings behind closed doors. The foundation of trust that once held the community together had cracked wide open, and in the middle of it all, Gerald plotted his next move. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the glow of subdivision lights in the distance, I felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. I had won the legal battle, yes, but I could sense the war wasn't over. Gerald had lost the courtroom, but he still had his followers, his clipboard army, and his obsession with control. The question wasn't whether he would strike back. It was when and how far he would go this time. The courtroom victory should have been the end of it. A clean break. A moment where the HOA realized they had overstepped, admitted defeat, and faded into the background. But people like Gerald didn't let go of power so easily. For him, the courtroom wasn't a final judgment. It was a wound to his pride. And a man like that would rather burn the entire neighborhood to the ground than admit he had lost control. At first, the retaliation was subtle. Notices began to appear on my gate again, though now they were unsigned, printed on cheap paper rather than embossed HOA letterhead. The violations listed were even more ridiculous than before. Noise pollution from the sound of my chainsaw clearing brush, unauthorized activity because I stacked lumber on my own land, visual disruption because my trailer could supposedly be seen from a cul-de-sac half a mile away. They knew the fines were meaningless. Yet the notices kept coming, small reminders that Gerald and his board weren't finished with me. Then came the gossip. Residents who had once waved at me when I drove past now turned their heads. Stories spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, that I was a squatter, that I had forged documents, that the court ruling was a fluke and would be overturned. At HOA meetings, Gerald reportedly described me as a parasite, trying to leech off the community. He knew the lawsuit had stripped away his legal authority, so now he leaned into fear and manipulation. But fear only works on those who don't know the truth. And the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks. Some residents, especially the younger families, started contacting me directly. They wanted answers. They wanted to know if it was true that their HOA had no legal right to enforce its rules. They wanted to see the deeds, the maps, the court ruling. And when I showed them, their shock quickly turned to anger. I realized then that Gerald's greatest weapon wasn't the HOA charter or the threat of fines. It was ignorance. For years, the residents had simply believed whatever the board told them. The courtroom had been the first fracture in that illusion, and now the cracks were spreading, which is exactly why Gerald escalated. It started with my truck. One morning, I found the tires slashed, deep gashes leaving them useless. A note was tucked under the windshield wiper, scrawled in messy handwriting. "Leave before it gets worse." A week later, my firewood pile went up in flames. The fire department ruled it arson, but without witnesses, nothing could be done. Then, late one night, as I was sitting on my porch, a rock smashed against the side of my trailer, followed by footsteps disappearing into the woods. This wasn't petty HOA harassment anymore. It was sabotage. I reported each incident to the police, but without clear evidence, their hands were tied. Gerald was too clever to get caught himself, and if it was his board members or loyal followers carrying out the dirty work, none of them were leaving a trail. The HOA was unraveling, and desperation was pushing them into darker territory. But if they thought intimidation would drive me out, they had underestimated me. The more they pushed, the more I dug. I filed requests with the county for HOA financial records. I reached out to former residents who had sold their homes and moved away, asking why they left. What I uncovered painted a picture of corruption so deep it was almost unbelievable. The HOA had been overcharging dues for years, funneling the excess into maintenance projects that never happened. They had bullied residents into paying fines under threat of foreclosure, even though many of those fines were illegal. Some board members had even sold properties at a profit after forcing families out with relentless penalties. Silverwood Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a machine. And Gerald was the one pulling the levers. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. Beating them in court had been one thing, but now I had a responsibility. I wasn't just protecting my own land anymore. I was sitting on the legal ownership of the entire subdivision. And with that came leverage. Real leverage. So I made a decision. I would expose the HOA completely. The first step was information. I printed copies of the court ruling, the deeds, and the county maps. Then I went door to door, delivering them directly to residents' mailboxes. No spin, no exaggeration, just the raw truth. I wanted people to see for themselves that the board's power was built on nothing. At first, the reaction was cautious. Some residents ignored the papers, clinging to Gerald's version of events, but others started to question. And when one brave family stood up at the next HOA meeting, waving the documents and demanding answers, the dominoes began to fall. Reports reached me that the meeting had descended into chaos. Gerald tried to shout down the questions, claiming the documents were fake. But when residents pulled out their own copies and demanded explanations, the board faltered. Voices rose, tempers flared, and for the first time, Gerald lost control of the room. It was the beginning of the end, but Gerald wasn't done. The night after that meeting, I woke to the sound of engines revving outside. A convoy of cars blocked the entrance to my property, headlights glaring like spotlights. Figures stood in the beams, shouting threats I couldn't fully make out. They stayed for nearly an hour, chanting and jeering, before finally peeling away into the night. It was a show of force, a desperate attempt to remind me that Silverwood Estates still belonged to Gerald's iron grip. But deep down I knew he was cornered. Bullies always roar the loudest when they sense their reign is crumbling. And crumble it did. Within days, a group of residents formally petitioned to dissolve the HOA. They cited the court ruling, the questionable finances, and the years of abuse. The petition gained momentum fast. Neighbors who had once cowered under Gerald's authority now stood together. United by outrage, Gerald fought tooth and nail, filing appeals, sending threats, and even trying to bribe residents to withdraw their signatures. But the tide had turned. Every piece of intimidation only fueled the rebellion. By the end of the month, nearly 2/3 of the subdivision had signed the petition. And once it passed, Gerald would lose not just his power, but his entire identity. The man who had built his life on control, who had fined me $250,000 for daring to exist on my own land, was about to watch his empire collapse in front of him, and I had a front row seat. The cracks in Silverwood Estates were no longer hidden. They had become fissures splitting the neighborhood apart. What began as murmurs after the courtroom ruling had erupted into open rebellion. For the first time in decades, residents weren't just whispering their frustrations behind closed doors. They were standing on lawns, gathering in cul-de-sacs, and declaring that the HOA's reign was over. It started small. A handful of homeowners, emboldened by the court ruling, stopped paying their dues. They posted copies of the petition to dissolve the HOA on bulletin boards and slipped them under doors. One woman even spray-painted the words, "Not my HOA," across her garage, visible to every car that passed. Then came the meetings. No longer confined to Gerald's carefully managed sessions, residents began holding their own gatherings in backyards and living rooms. They compared stories of fines, intimidation, and harassment. They shared evidence of financial mismanagement, which spread like wildfire. One neighbor revealed how the HOA had forced him to repaint his house 3 times in a single year, citing shade discrepancies, all while Gerald's own fence rotted in plain sight. Another spoke about losing thousands in fabricated landscaping violations, while Gerald's allies never faced penalties. Every tale added fuel to the fire. The board tried to counter the movement. Of course, Gerald sent out newsletters dismissing the petition as illegal. He patrolled the streets with his clipboard again, marking down phantom violations and slipping threatening letters into mailboxes. But instead of instilling fear, his tactics now provoked laughter, jeers, and open defiance. The aura of power he had built was gone, and with it went the unity of the board itself. Some board members, sensing the inevitable, began to distance themselves. One quietly resigned, citing personal reasons. Another admitted, under the pressure of angry neighbors, that Gerald had pushed through decisions without votes, effectively running the HOA as a personal fiefdom. Gerald's allies were dwindling, but he clung to control with the desperation of a drowning man. The turning point came when residents uncovered the HOA's financial records, misused funds, inflated budgets, and unexplained expenses. The most damning revelation was a series of consulting fees paid directly to Gerald himself, funneled from dues. For years, he had been enriching himself while accusing residents of selfishness and negligence. When those numbers hit the community, the revolt exploded. Yards that had once been meticulously pruned under threat of fines grew wild in symbolic protest. Residents stopped following HOA regulations entirely. RVs were parked on driveways, basketball hoops reappeared, fences were painted in bright colors. Silverwood Estates, once a picture-perfect model of control, now looked alive with rebellion. Gerald stormed through the streets, clipboard in hand, screaming at neighbors who ignored him. Some filmed him and posted the videos online where they went viral. The man who had once been feared was now a spectacle, mocked and ridiculed. His anger only made things worse. I watched it all unfold from the edge of my land, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. It wasn't just about me anymore. Silverwood Estates was imploding under the weight of its own corruption, and I had simply pulled the first thread. But the unraveling of a regime doesn't happen without chaos. And chaos is dangerous. As the petition to dissolve the HOA neared the required majority, Gerald grew more erratic. He began sending mass emails filled with threats, claiming that without the HOA, property values would plummet, crime would skyrocket, and outsiders would take over the neighborhood. He stoked fear in anyone still willing to listen, trying to claw back loyalty with doomsday predictions. Some residents wavered, unsure if they were trading one nightmare for another. But most had already decided anything was better than Gerald's rule. The day the petition signatures crossed the two-thirds threshold, a celebration erupted. Families gathered in the park at the subdivision center, holding homemade signs, grilling food, and cheering. Children ran through sprinklers while parents toasted to a future without fines, threats, or Gerald's endless lectures. But Gerald didn't take it as a defeat. He took it as war. That night, as the party wound down, residents woke to chaos. Spray paint streaked across fences and garage doors. Traitors, you'll regret this. Property value dead. Mailboxes were smashed. Tires were slashed. It was vandalism on a scale too large to be coincidence. Everyone knew who was behind it, even if no one saw him do it. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with fear and outrage. Some demanded police intervention, while others whispered that Gerald was finally losing his grip on reality. The once proud president of Silverwood Estates had become a vandal in the night. But Gerald wasn't finished. A week later, a letter circulated, hand-delivered to every house in the neighborhood. It wasn't on official letterhead, but it bore Gerald's handwriting. In it, he declared that Silverwood Estates belonged to him, that the petition was invalid, and that anyone refusing to pay dues would face legal seizure of assets. It was pure bluff, and most residents knew it. But the tone of the letter was alarming. It wasn't just arrogant anymore, it was unhinged. That evening I received my own letter, slipped under the gate of my land. It was shorter than the rest, just a few sentences scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. This was never your fight. You should have stayed quiet. Now you'll pay. I read it under the porch light, the paper trembling in my hand. Gerald wasn't just lashing out at his neighbors anymore. He was turning his sights back on me. The irony was almost poetic. Months earlier, he had tried to fine me $250,000 for daring to live freely on my own land. Now, stripped of authority, mocked by his neighbors, and abandoned by his board, all he had left was his obsession with destroying me. But what Gerald didn't realize was that while he had been burning bridges, I had been building them. Residents who once kept their distance were now calling me for advice, thanking me for exposing the truth. Some even suggested I step in to formally take over the land's management. Since I legally owned the ground beneath the subdivision, it wasn't a role I had ever wanted. But the chaos Gerald left behind made one thing clear. Silverwood Estates needed leadership, real leadership, not bullying disguised as order. As I looked out at the subdivision lights flickering in the distance, I knew the endgame was approaching. Gerald had lost his army, lost his power, and lost the trust of the very people he once ruled. But a man like him doesn't go quietly. The petition might have broken the HOA, but Gerald wasn't finished. He was cornered, humiliated, and dangerous, and he had nothing left to lose. The next move he made would be his boldest and his most reckless yet. The weeks following the petition should have been a turning point for Silverwood Estates. The HOA was effectively dissolved, its power dismantled by the very people who had once bowed to it. Families walked their streets with a sense of freedom they hadn't known in years. No more arbitrary fines. No more letters stuffed into mailboxes. No more Gerald standing at their doors, clipboard in hand, but beneath that relief was tension. Everyone knew Gerald wasn't finished. For decades, control had been his identity, his lifeline. To lose it so publicly was a humiliation he couldn't tolerate. And when a man who thrives on power has nothing left, desperation takes over. The first sign came quietly. Strange vehicles parked near the entrances of Silverwood, headlights cutting through the night before disappearing again. Rumors spread that Gerald had hired private security, though no one could prove it. Some swore they saw him pacing through the streets in the early hours, muttering to himself, carrying folders thick with papers no one cared to see anymore. Then came the escalation. One morning, residents woke to find barricades at the subdivision entrances, traffic cones, chains, even homemade HOA checkpoint signs. Gerald and two of his most loyal supporters stood there, blocking cars and demanding to see proof of dues payment before allowing people to pass. It was delusion masquerading as authority, and it didn't last long. When the police arrived, Gerald argued with them for nearly an hour before being forced to clear the road. But the damage was done. His neighbors, once merely resentful, now feared him. Mothers hurried their children inside when he walked by. Families installed cameras and extra locks. Silverwood Estates was no longer a neighborhood in rebellion. It was a community bracing itself against its own former leader. I stayed on the sidelines as much as I could, but Gerald hadn't forgotten me. His letters became more personal, scrawled in fury, always delivered in the dead of night. He accused me of stealing his legacy, of turning the neighborhood against him. He warned that I had no idea what was coming. The breaking point came on a stormy evening in late summer. Lightning split the sky, rain pounding against my trailer roof. I was inside, sorting through another stack of records from the county when the power suddenly cut out. At first I thought it was the storm. But when I stepped outside, lantern in hand, I saw smoke rising from the edge of my property. My lumber pile was on fire again, only this time the blaze was bigger, fiercer, and dangerously close to the trees that bordered Silverwood. I called the fire department, my voice tight with urgency. As I waited, I spotted movement at the tree line. A figure stood there, barely illuminated by the flames, watching. Even in the shadows, I recognized the stance, the squared shoulders, the stubborn set of the jaw. Gerald. By the time the fire trucks arrived, he was gone, vanished into the night. The firefighters managed to contain the blaze before it spread, but the message was clear. Gerald was done with intimidation. He wanted destruction. Word of the fire spread quickly. By the next morning, half the neighborhood was at my gate, demanding something be done. They weren't just angry anymore, they were scared. Gerald had crossed the line from nuisance to threat, so I made a decision I'd been avoiding for months. If Gerald wanted to make this about control, I would give him the truth he feared most. That evening, I held a gathering in the subdivision's Central Park. Families came with flashlights and umbrellas, whispering nervously as they filled the space. Even those who had once stood by Gerald now showed up, anxious and restless. They wanted answers, and I had them. I stood before them with a binder in my hands, not unlike the one Gerald used to carry. But mine wasn't filled with fabricated fines and empty threats. Mine was proof of ownership, proof of the court ruling, proof of the corruption that had funded Gerald's grip on power for years. I laid it out plainly. I owned the land beneath their neighborhood. Legally, Gerald's HOA had never had authority. The dues they had paid, the fines they had suffered, the harassment they had endured, it was all built on lies. And while Gerald had tried to bury me under $250,000 in imaginary fines, it was his empire that had crumbled instead. There was no applause when I finished. Just silence. A heavy, stunned silence as the truth sank in. Then slowly people began to nod. Voices rose. Some cried out in anger at Gerald's betrayal. Others expressed relief that it was finally over. But the most striking thing was what happened next. The residents, for so long divided and intimidated, began to turn toward one another instead of me. They talked about rebuilding, not just their neighborhood, but their sense of community. Without Gerald, without the HOA, they were free to decide what Silverwood would be. It was the final nail in Gerald's coffin. The man himself didn't show that night. But a week later, police cars were spotted outside his house. Word spread quickly. He had been arrested for arson, vandalism, and harassment. The same neighbors who once cowered under his rule now stood on sidewalks. Watching in silence as he was led away in handcuffs, Silverwood Estates was free at last. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The petition to dissolve the HOA was finalized. Residents repainted their homes however they pleased. Kids played basketball in driveways again. The place looked less like a staged postcard and more like a real community. Messier maybe, but alive. And as for me, I didn't press charges beyond what the police pursued. I didn't need revenge. Gerald had destroyed himself far more thoroughly than I ever could. My focus was on the land, on the quiet stretch of creek where I planned to build my house. The chaos of Silverwood had spilled into my life, but now, finally, the storm had passed. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought about the irony. Gerald had fined me for violations on my land, never realizing I owned the ground beneath his. He had tried to strip me of everything, but in the end, he was the one stripped of power, dignity, and freedom. Silverwood Estates would move on, and so would I. But the story of Gerald and his HOA, the man who thought he owned everything, only to discover he owned nothing, would live on as a cautionary tale, because in the end, power built on lies will always collapse. And those who build their thrones on control eventually find themselves buried beneath it.